Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And again, this is session 1 in our Development Ready webinar series, and we are thrilled that you are all joining us, and we are especially thrilled to introduce our first set of speakers today. Before we do that, I am just going to introduce everyone to Google Meets a little bit. We do ask that you consider keep your camera off to minimize distractions. Stay muted unless you're speaking. Take advantage of the chat box and raise hand feature. And we will also be recording this webinar, which does record everything in the chat as well. So just be aware of that. And Liliana, now that I have made the announcement about the recording, go ahead and hit record. And we'll get started with that. So just to test everyone's comfortability in Google Meets, go ahead and use the chat feature now to enter your name, let us know what community you're joining us from, and if there is a particular project that you all have in mind right now. We would love to see the different communities that we have represented today. We are going to ask that everyone hold their questions until the end, or go ahead and type your questions into the chat box while the presenters are speaking. And then once the presentation is over, we'll go through the questions in the chat box and answer those in order, more or less, as we're able to. We also, I believe, have participation from Virginia's Building and Fire Regulations Department today. So they are available to answer questions in the chat as well, if they are very specific to how Virginia does business. Without further ado, we'll welcome our guest speakers today. We have Elizabeth Williams, who is faculty with the Incremental Development Alliance, and Neil Heller, also faculty for the Incremental Development Alliance, one of our favorite partners in the real estate development field. And to get us kicked off today, I am going to turn it over to Alex Nielsen to talk a little bit about IDA and our speakers today.
Great.
Alex, I'm going to stop sharing, and now it's all yours.
Sounds good. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alex Nielsen, and please forgive my voice, just getting over a little sickness. So I'm Alex Nielsen. I'm the Director of Operations with Incremental Development Alliance. I've been with the organization for about 4 years and currently stationed in Atlanta, Georgia. And we've done work with VA/DHCD in the past, doing some training programs. So we are extremely excited to do another round of training. Can everyone see my screen?
No, it is not being shared yet.
Sorry.
I know Google Meets is the least utilized. There it goes. You're on, Alex.
Okay, great. Again, we are joined by Neil Heller and Elizabeth Williams. We are extremely excited to kick this off. And a huge thank you again to Rebecca and our sponsors at VA/DHCD. So Incremental Development Alliance, we are a nonprofit educational organization. We've been around since 2015. We have worked in about 25 communities across the US, and we also have done some work in Canada as well. Our goal is to cultivate 1,000 small developers, and we have reached this amount of folks over all sectors in the last couple of years, especially since 2015, since we started. And our mission is to help local entrepreneurs and civic leaders strengthen their neighborhoods through small-scale real estate projects. And again, we are an educational nonprofit. What we really try to focus on is training locals in a specific community and area, the essentials on how to build a strong neighborhood. And we primarily do this through training and coaching. And when we talk about locals in a specific community, it's not just small scale developers, that's who we do target, but we also work with folks from public, private, and nonprofit sectors as well. And our main focus is also on infill development when we are kind of teaching and training locals on how to build a stronger neighborhood. And then I will actually pass it off to Neil.
Can you pull your screen back up real quick, Alex?
Yes, I sure can. Do you want me to go through these next couple ones?
Yeah, we've just got a couple of slides that kind of show some of the work that our alumni have done. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Neil Heller. I'm in Portland, Oregon, faculty with the Incremental Development Alliance, probably going on 5 years now, hosting and being part of different workshops around the country in lots of different market types, Albuquerque, Flint, Michigan, and lots of interesting places, Kalamazoo. But I also have a firm called Neighborhood Workshop. And so I employ a performa-powered planning approach to adjusting zoning standards to get the types of development that a community needs to see. I'm also an owner-occupied investor. And so my wife and I have been using owner-occupied strategies to buy and fix up places here in Portland and then rent them out. And then we say that we do that to provide our tenants with a positive rental experience. But I have a past as an urban designer and then made the switch over to urban planner, and that's my function now. But let's go into these alumni projects. This is Mike Keene in South Bend, Indiana, has become an integral part of the organization, doing his projects in South Bend, later to become a fellow faculty member, but he's working on interesting projects in South Bend. And so what you see here on the left is a home that was fixed up. In the front of that piece, in front of the house, the residential portion is what we call an accessory commercial unit. So there's a little bit of workspace in the front. And then on the right are a couple of tiny homes that he built to offer more affordable home ownership. Now, the lesson that he learned here was that you don't just start going out and doing development. He has built the first new construction in his neighborhood that his neighborhood has seen in 40 years because of this investment. But the lesson learned from Mike's project is that he had to start small and build comps through renovations to then be able to appraise and get the new construction built. And then next, I believe we have Carrie's project in Bothell, Washington, so other side of the country. And what you see, if you look on the left behind the building in the front here, that's his triplex. He bought that triplex, fixed it up, lived in it, rented it out. Then he moved to purchased a lot in front of that, built a fourplex. And he did this owner occupied in the downtown area. And so Elizabeth will talk more about what we call farming, and that's sort of focusing on an area that you care about and doing development there. And then lastly, really super small scale, these folks in East Point, Georgia, got their feet wet with a little bit of creating an ADU. And then by doing that, they're able to offset some of their mortgage. And so they understand now how an ADU can be also considered a mortgage helper. And this has allowed them to, it takes some of the pressure off of household income. And so they've experienced a little bit more freedom, and she's been able to switch jobs because of that. And then I'll kick things over to Elizabeth and she can introduce herself.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil.
Give me 1 second here to pull this up.
You've got it, Elizabeth. It's up.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that. Making sure I've got all my screens in one place. Okay, everyone can see my screen and hear me, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
All righty, let's do this. So I'm Elizabeth Ford Williams. I am trained as an architect and city planner, and I lead urban design at a firm called Kronberg Urbanists and Architects in Atlanta, Georgia. I am a self-proclaimed zoning nerd, and I teach a course on zoning part-time at Georgia Tech, and of course also on faculty at UW. So going to just break down quickly what we're going to cover today. So really broken down into two parts. The first part is really going to be framing what we mean by incremental development. So the what, the why, and the where of it, and also go over some common barriers. And then the second part, which Neil will cover, is going to be about strategies for overcoming some of these barriers and also how to get more incremental development in your place right now. So Neil teed this up, but in the world of small scale and incremental development, we talk about a concept called finding your farm. And your farm is really a metaphor for a localized effort to cultivate both life and value in a place. And so when we say focus on your farm, what we mean is focus your efforts in a neighborhood or an area of your city that you care about. And the reason for this is that it'll be a lot easier in a place that you know and love already to be able to assess the current conditions, identify opportunities or needs, and cultivate relationships and ultimately build your experience. And what this does, it allows you to focus on building a stronger neighborhood one project at a time. And so small scale development, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're right off the bat building a new building or even purchasing a property. A first small step or an incremental step might look something like partnering with an existing property owner to help reposition their underused parking lot into a pop-up market, or to help them reposition their building towards a higher functioning asset. But a takeaway from that is to make sure you don't do it for free, that there is value in this work, no matter how small it is. And then we like to say that farming creates a flywheel. And what we mean by that is that initial successes help build on each other. So Neil showed a couple of great examples of that, but this is an example from a faculty member at IncDev, Monty Anderson. And he started off with these 3 storefronts here. And then the success of these storefronts led to then the addition of this taco shop. And so you can literally see in the image where you have the newer sidewalk, the newer parking. And so the initial successes build on each other, and it allows for more community amenities. So all of these are helping serve the community, but also allows more opportunities for locals within the community to build wealth, to grow their own businesses. We also talk a lot about steps, and I'm going to explain what we mean by that. So we work in steps, and STEP is both an acronym, but it's also, most importantly, it's a process. It's a way of thinking about development. And so STEP stands for small scale, time enhanced, entrepreneurial, and purposeful. And I'm going to unpack what each of those means. So starting with small scale, what does it mean to be small scale? Well, there's both a physical component to it and also a more conceptual component. And so physically, we're talking about something that's between 0 and 3 stories and less than 20 units. And conceptually, what we're talking about is something that's small enough for local people to develop and own themselves. So incremental development is really locally driven development. And when we say small, we really mean it. This can be as small as a pop-up tent on somebody else's property or a shed in your own backyard. But just because it's small doesn't mean it doesn't pack a punch. So the point of these, no matter the size, is that you're offering a community amenity and you're serving as a springboard for your future endeavors, whether you're just building your experience in development, or you're building relationships, or you're growing your financing to take that next step. And also really important to note that small scale is a spectrum. So there is a range of small, both for residential typologies and for commercial typologies. So on the residential side of things, small can range from a hack to an existing home, like adding a basement apartment or an accessory dwelling unit, and it can go all the way up to larger scale apartments. But remember, 0 to 3 stories and less than 20 units. And on the commercial side, or incremental retail, it can range from a pop-up tent all the way up to mixed-use buildings. So the spectrum is not just about the scale, but also kind of about the project complexity. And I want to unpack the term missing middle housing. It was shown in that last slide. So missing middle housing is a term that was coined by a design firm, Opticos, and they define it as a range of house scale buildings with multiple units that are compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes located in a walkable neighborhood. So there's a lot to unpack in that, but put simply, missing middle housing is really the band of housing that exists between detached single-family homes and the larger kind of mid-rise apartment complex that we see so much of built today. And then there's also another band on the other side of detached single-family homes of missing small housing. And that's sort of the smallest, most incremental end of the spectrum that could be something like a tiny house or a backyard cottage or a basement apartment. And the point is that our built environment can be so much richer than it is today. And our housing options specifically can be so much broader. And ultimately, a broader range of housing options accommodates what we call housing choice, which means it allows for a variety of income levels and life stages to live in one place. So it's really critical to the diversity and social health of a community to have this missing middle housing. And another note about scale is scale speaks to the massing and form of a building, but not the style of a building. So small scale is really about being pedestrian oriented and human scale in nature, but those buildings can look contemporary or modern, or they can look more traditional. And then we've mentioned this, but there is a spectrum of small. So on the larger end of the spectrum, in that the range that we looked at, you can get up to 20 unit apartment buildings or mixed use buildings. These are much more complicated than the lower end of the spectrum that we were talking about, the kind of house hacks. And so while there's a range in small scale, there's also a range in the complexity of the project type and the experience of the experience level of the developer working on these project types. So we like to say not all of them are starter projects, and Neil will talk in greater detail about thresholds. Okay, so that was a lot in that first letter, small scale. The second letter in STEP is time enhanced. STEP buildings are buildings that learn and evolve over time, and like a fine wine, they improve with age. So what they're doing is they're depicting the many life stages a home or a business can take, and then showing how those buildings can evolve to meet your changing needs. So for example, you might start with one small storefront building, and over time grow to add more, like that example shown earlier. And on the residential end, you might start with a duplex or a small quadplex, and over time grow and expand the back to add more units. And the point behind this is that these buildings gain value over time through better cash flow and contribution to their neighborhood, their place. So this is not just about passive appreciation. The E stands for entrepreneurial. So these are working buildings that earn an income, and they don't rely on speculative gains. So cash flow is really what makes STEP buildings so resilient over time. The fact that they can pay for their own maintenance and their own adaptation. And it's not just about the buildings being entrepreneurial, it's entrepreneurial people that are developing these buildings. And they're doing this by finding those creative ways to fill the gaps in their farm, their market, and their neighborhood. Great example of this from another faculty member. This is a project in Buffalo, a rehab of an existing home. This building is not only earning an income, so being an entrepreneurial building in that way, but it's also created a launch pad for a small business within the community. So it's helping another entrepreneur in the community, in this case, a woman who owns a pie shop, to build her own business and to help her grow wealth and start her launch pad to her next endeavor. And finally, the P is for purposeful. So STEP buildings are designed to be profitable, yes, but they don't exist solely on income. So they're really brought to life by local people who are asking themselves, what does my neighborhood need? And what is the next small step that I can take to provide that? So with purpose, these buildings really help bring out the life and the soul of a place. And ultimately, they give more than they take. Another great example from an alumni. This is a project in Portland, Maine. This project provided both a bus shelter and a parklet on the streetscape here, and helped activate a previously dead quarter. So they were breathing life back into the public realm, not just the private realm. They also modeled this building after an old theater that had long since disappeared in the community. And so in that way, it helped to kind of keep alive an old landmark in the collective memory of this place. So giving back quite a bit. So check out the Step Building Families. It's really an amazing collection of typologies. There's so many types to dig into, and it covers that full spectrum of small from both residential and commercial that we talked about, from house hacks to commercial incubation up to the larger end of the missing middle housing spectrum and more mixed use buildings. And these are real building types. So this catalog of building types was developed by studying existing places where we work for these small scale, time enhanced, entrepreneurial and purposeful buildings. So look around your neighborhoods and you'll notice that a lot of these already exist. So in summary, what's incremental development? 0 to 3 stories, less than 20 units. It cultivates a neighborhood over a long period of time. It's projects that are income producing and that fill market gaps and physical gaps in your community. And who is an incremental or small developer? These are folks that are locally driven. They're working primarily in their own neighborhoods and places. They're purposeful. They're mainly doing this just because they care, and ultimately because they can spark something bigger than themselves in the process. We like to say it's about, yes, a focus on ROI, return on investment, but it's also about your return on community, ROC. And we hear people ask us a lot, how do we find more small developers, or how do we get more small developers in our community? And the answer is you don't find them, you grow them. And you do this by fostering an environment where they can succeed. All right, so we've framed the what of incremental development, and I want to kind of back up and talk about the why, understand the context of why incremental development is important for your place. And so I'll ground this in just kind of the way we used to build our places in the past and the way we have been building in the last couple of decades. And so this is an example of the same town in Georgia. This is Covington, Georgia, and this is probably typical of every place that we've ever worked. So on the right-hand side, you see kind of the historic core of this town, and you can see that it's a mixed-use place, it's small scale, it's walkable, and it's incremental, meaning it was built out over time, mostly by individuals, probably mostly local individuals, versus the types of development that we see so much of today. Again, this is the same town, just right outside the downtown. You can see just from the photo, separated uses and single uses, primarily auto-oriented, primarily built all at one time and built by probably very few individuals and probably not very many local people. And so how we build today, over here on the left, has a lot of negative consequences for our places and is a very unsustainable way to build in every sense of the word. So just want to unpack a few of those consequences. The first is we have a big supply-demand imbalance in our housing market, and it drives up the cost of living. So this graphic is showing on the left the percentage of people in different age groups that want to live in a walkable community. And you can see a majority of people in every age group would prefer to live in a walkable community. And on the right, you can see the percentage of people who actually live in a walkable community. So it's a lot less. And the reason is not that people are just choosing not to live where they want to live. And it's also not that we have a walkable neighborhood shortage. We have a development shortage within our walkable neighborhoods. And we know what happens when there's a lack of supply for a growing demand. It results in rising costs. So we're seeing costs of housing and development rising all over the country. We also have a big infrastructure imbalance in our places, and this is caused by that type of sprawling low-density development pattern that we just looked at. So this is a great graphic from a group called Urban 3 that shows the infrastructure growth per capita in the city of Lafayette, Louisiana over time. And so they mapped out over a 70-year period population growth, which grew not insignificantly, and then they mapped out the growth of the feet of pipe per person grew 10 times. So population grew 3.5 feet of pipe per person 10 times. And the number of fire hydrants per 1,000 people grew over 20 times. So you have to ask yourself, who is paying for all of this infrastructure, both now and who's going to pay for it in the future when it comes time to maintain all of this? So low density development patterns are really financially unsustainable for places to build and maintain in the long run. And in that same vein, low density development patterns also generate less tax value per acre. So great resource or a great graphic from a great resource, Strong Towns, illustrating kind of the same example of the town of Covington. So 9 downtown blocks, historic downtown, versus a shopping mall on the edge of town. 16 taxable acres versus 23 taxable acres, and then the net value per acre mapped out here. And so what that gets you is the tax value per acre in the 9 downtown blocks is significantly higher than the tax value per acre recouped for the shopping mall that takes up more land. And of course, this type of development, as we just saw, requires more infrastructure both to build and maintain. And if you have less tax revenue to cover that, you're really in a financial pickle. And so when we talk about where to focus our incremental development efforts, we're really talking about the places on the right. We're talking about our walkable areas that have existing infrastructure, not talking about the edges, and we're not talking about the greenfield developments, whether they are pedestrian oriented or not. We're not really talking about drive-to urbanism. So generally, these are the pre-World War II areas of town, whether it's a small town, it might be a historic downtown like this. It might also be a neighborhood core. And why pre-World War II? We say that because generally these areas were developed before cars, zoning, and subsidy were the primary drivers of development, meaning they're our most walkable, mixed use, and therefore cost-efficient places. And a good rule of thumb when we say focus on your core, most people will walk or bike 5 to 10 minutes to get to daily goods and services. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to walk a quarter of a mile, 15 to 20 minutes to walk a half mile. So a 20-minute neighborhood or a half-mile radius is a good rule of thumb around wherever your part of your community is. And then providing infill development within that zone near your downtown or your core really helps ultimately support your place. So key takeaways: focus on the farm, work in steps, 0 to 3 stories, and really understand the why behind incremental development. And so if incremental development is so great, where is all of it? Why are we not still doing it? Well, there's 3 main factors that drive what gets built today. The first is regulations, and we're primarily talking about zoning and building codes, but there's a lot more that goes into that. So the first question is it legal? The second thing is finance. Good question to ask yourself is, do local banks service these product types? And then finally, market forces. So does it pencil? Is it worth it? First, in talking about regulations, the first question to ask yourself is it legal? So in most of our cities, when we have come and applied zoning retroactively, we have made a lot of these step building typologies and the most beloved parts of our cities illegal to rebuild today. So things like attached accessory units, which might be a basement apartment here, or a small scale apartment that sits next to a single family home, or a neighborhood commercial or live workspace that sits next to a single family home. These are illegal in most places today. So the first thing we need to do is re-legalize step buildings in our walkable neighborhoods. So great questions to ask yourself is, does your place allow ADUs, detached or detached? Do we allow small apartments or other types of middle housing? Do we allow neighborhood scale commercial? But we have to also understand that it's a lot more than just zoning. So our regulations work as a system, and there are lots of regulations that dictate the built environment. There are site regulations and there are building code regulations. So when we talk about site, yes, we're talking about zoning, but we're also talking about land use, which comes from our comprehensive development plan. We're talking about subdivision ordinances that dictate things like minimum lot sizes or minimum frontages. We're talking about things like tree ordinances or landscape standards that require lots of open space or strict protections of trees, stormwater ordinances, engineering standards or right-of-way standards. And then on the building side of things, and Neil will dig into this more, we're talking about building codes, and there's various building codes depending on your type of building you're doing. Energy codes, mechanical, electrical, plumbing codes, fire codes is a big one, accessibility codes. So all of these things factor into what is possible to build.
Elizabeth, you appear to have muted yourself.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, there you go.
Sorry about that. How
No
how
problem.
long ago did I mute myself?
Just a few seconds.
Okay, great. All right, I'll pick back up right here. So process of the regulatory systems matters as much as the regulations themselves. So typically projects get reviewed by each department, and they're typically reviewed in silos. So when we think about all these things, not everyone that's reviewing these is reviewing them with all of the other ordinances or codes in mind. And so that can make things, it can create conflicts in projects, and it can also create unpredictability in the system, which makes it really hard for a small developer to be able to navigate this. And conflicting requirements can make building small projects impossible, both physically and financially. So it's really important that we understand the implications of our regulations on small projects. So just to list a few, there's both physical and financial trade-offs, and the physical trade-offs occur when the size of the site makes it hard to achieve all of the requirements of the development code on one piece of land. And that can be things like minimum on-site parking requirements, minimum driveway standards, minimum fire access, minimum stormwater or landscape standards, required tree protection, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, financial trade-offs occur when the requirements of the development code increase the cost of the project approval and construction. And this weighs really heavily on the affordability of both units and commercial spaces. And Neil will talk more about building code requirements and thresholds, fire code requirements and thresholds, and things of that nature. So what can we do? Well, best case scenario, our places would be able to right size our regulations to allow for more small scale development. This is a really big lift. So the first thing is legalize small scale development in your place, but start small. Don't try and rewrite your entire zoning code all at once, but start by asking yourself, what is the smallest step I can take? Do we allow ADUs? Is that manageable? And then next, to streamline processes to create a clear and predictable path so that you don't have to be a super expert in this stuff to know how to navigate the system. And then allow flexibility in development standards. So understanding all of those trade-offs and all of the conflicts that might come into play with all of these different regulations, allow some flexibility for small scale infill, such as flexibility, parking minimums, lot sizes, stormwater requirements, trees, fire access, et cetera. But most importantly, obviously this would be best case scenario, is to get our regulations totally aligned and where we want them to be. But we also need to know how to work within our existing regulations in the meantime. So Neil's going to talk about this. And know that across the country and the continent, a lot of cities are starting this big lift. They're changing their regulations to encourage better infill. This is the long game. So if this is something you care about, every person needs to get involved on this, not just in their job, but in their own community. This is part of that flywheel effect. So there are a lot of great precedents to look to for people that have been doing this, including Buffalo, Durham, North Carolina, Portland, both Maine, and I'm sure Neil can talk about Oregon, Greenville, South Carolina, just to name a few. A lot of people are starting to go this route. And then want to talk about the market forces. So does it pencil? There are a lot of costs associated with development, whether you are large or small. So some of those costs, some examples are the cost of land, the cost to entitle a property. Maybe you have to rezone it. The cost of construction, including both the cost of materials and the cost of labor. All of these things are costs that have gone up significantly in the last 5 to 10 years. And then there's also the very real cost, I will call it the brain cost of navigating the process. So understanding how to do this. And so another reason that we say that incremental development or infill is missing is because of the high brain damage it causes and the low returns. So just to explain this graphic, single family development is pretty easy to do. Our systems are set up to support it. It's very low brain damage. It doesn't provide huge returns, but enough to balance the amount of work that has to go into it. On the other end of the spectrum, the larger scale development, the mid-rise apartments and up, very complex. You need to be skilled to navigate that system, but generates really high returns, so it is worth it. But incremental infill sits here in the middle. It is almost as difficult as doing a large scale development project, but generates lower returns. And so the people generally that are doing this are just the people that really care. So if we want to see more of this in our community, we have to make it easier, the process easier to navigate, so that the risk and the time and the expertise involved is worth the rewards that come with it. And with that, well, I'll say a few takeaways. So building small is often more difficult. That's why we're not seeing as much of it. Regulatory barriers add complexity and cost and need to be right sized. And the good news is there's major updates happening nationwide to look to for precedents. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Neil.
Hi, everyone. I'm back, and let me get my screen going here. If I just do this, if I do this, does this work?
Not seeing it yet.
Okay. Alrighty, let's do this.
It's a finicky system. All right, we see your presentation, Neil.
Okay, we're good to go. Great. I think I
Yep,
just saw a
that's
comment
good.
about contractors, and yeah, I'm going to mention that here in a second. But I want to talk with you about right sizing your project within the various regulatory thresholds to keep your project feasible. Like Elizabeth said, there can be high brain damage with little return, and so the idea is to not overstep a threshold and add even more complexity and more cost to your project, because this is already hard enough, and especially if you're starting out, you don't want to go ahead and make it harder for yourself. So let's just kind of go through this and think about how we can do this legally, but keep it feasible. So don't discount small. Like I said, development is hard, so don't make it harder. Keep it simple. And opportunity cost is an economic term that means it's the other stuff you could have done with the same resources. And so if you could also say, if building 20 units will take you 3 years to plan and execute, you could think, well, how many duplexes could I have done in that same amount of time? And so weighing those options. Right. And so here we are repeating it again. This is hard enough. Don't make it harder. So I'm going to cover these things, how to right size your project. So we're going to go through talking about doing something legal. And this doesn't mean to do something illegal. What we mean is don't try for a rezone on your first project or try to go get variances. Or oftentimes in a zoning code, there will be something called conditional use or approval that takes extra time and review. So keep it within the confines of legality. And another term for that is by right. We'll go through and suggest that you do something that you're good at, or within the realm of what your own level of sophistication is. Give your community what it needs. Insist that revenues match cost, and we'll continue to repeat that as well. Take advantage of code thresholds, which we'll cover, and then use the most simple financing that works for your project. So let's go through these. Right? Do something legal. Start with something within the zoning rules. Make use of legal non-conforming uses. So what is a non-conforming use? A non-conforming use is something that maybe as zoning has changed over time, you'll have a building that it used to be legal and now is not, but it exists in the real world. So maybe you might have a small apartment building or a fourplex in a single family neighborhood that you could not build today, but in the past you could. And so it's currently a non-conforming use. But guess what? Like I said, it's probably an existing building. And in existing buildings, we suggest is the best way for a small developer to get started, because it still requires financing, and it still may require some level of construction or update. It requires lease up and property management. And all of these are great experiences to get started and build your team. But by starting with an existing building, you're also exposing yourself to a little bit less risk, because if everything goes south, it's still a sellable asset. And probably one of the most familiar ways that folks get started is within accessory dwelling unit. These are an excellent way for a homeowner to become familiar with that development process and make those connections for later projects. You can start to meet an architect, meet a contractor, and then build that relationship, meet maybe with somebody from finance. Right, so let's kind of take a look at some of these. These are small scale options that a homeowner might be able to do. And as we talk about accessory dwelling units, they could be attached to a house like you see on the left here, or they could be detached and just kind of a backyard cottage. And then on the right is kind of the maxed out accessory strategy, which is the bootleg triplex, we call it. And this is the strategy that I'm actually doing on my property currently. Without an attached suite, I have a basement suite. And then we add the detached ADU in the backyard later. So it's kind of an incremental approach. But this is a strategy that works well in restrictive single dwelling zones, provided that your zoning allows ADUs. When you look at these cards, though, these images, I just kind of wanted to explain a couple things to you, kind of how to read these. You've got, the name of the type, and you've got a description about it. But on the bottom there's a couple things that I want to point out. So the arrow, and actually it's a house icon, talks about how it could be financed. And so you see on the bottom, it says 30-year. So that just means you could get that. You can pay for this with an owner-occupied standard 30-year mortgage. And then you'll see IRC and IBC. So IRC is highlighted. That means the International Residential Code. We'll get into that in a moment. And then on the very right, there's a sprinkler icon. And that would mean, is this sprinkled building or not? So if you see these pop up and you see those icons on the bottom, it'll give you a little bit more information. But also, we talk about units, we talk about buildings, but consider what you want versus what you need. Do you want extra income? Do you just want additional office space or a workspace, right? There are different options that fall below the threshold of what we call a unit. And that could be, maybe you've got a large house and you're looking at potentially renting out some rooms. That's one way. That's not adding, it's adding some extra income, or it's relieving some of your mortgage liability, and or, well, through a shared house, renting out bedrooms. There's another unit type called co-living that we're seeing more of. And those are, units with little kitchenettes in them, but with a common kitchen and living room. A flex shed is something that can be, you can go to a Home Depot, you can buy a shed, and there's nothing holding you back from improving the inside of that. You could deck it out with insulation, wallboard, and you can make it a nice workspace. Got to be careful though not to run any plumbing or electricity to it. Maybe an extension cord, but I won't tell on you. Another word for that is a detached bedroom, which is an interesting interpretation of a zoning code where you're adding to your house, but you're just adding a bedroom as a piece on the property. So it's not an ADU, it's just an extension of the house, but it's just detached. And sometimes you can have in that you can have a bathroom and like a little washing station, but you can't have a full-blown kitchen or anything like that. And then a guest suite is oftentimes in local zoning codes, a guest suite or unit is defined as not having a stove. So you can have a bathroom, you can have everything you would need to live. As long as you don't add that stove, it won't be considered a unit. You can even have its own locking door. And so it's kind of set up perfectly for an Airbnb suite or a living space, and maybe with a hot plate and a toaster oven, right? So it'd be a plug-in, and you wouldn't have the 220 volt connection. So, so let's move on here. And so we tell people, don't I mean, do what you're good at, right? Don't try to learn, don't try to do everything all at once. And we see this in every training that we do. People mean well, and I appreciate that they mean well, but oftentimes they're proposing, maybe a food cart pod mixed with a community commissary kitchen, with some artist spaces that are affordable, and then some affordable housing made out of shipping containers that have like green roofs. It's a lot. And so we just try to say that your small first time project, you don't need to solve all of your societal ills all at once. Kind of find something that works and focus on it, because each and every one of those ideas that I just described are extraordinarily complex, to work out, and to work out the finance and leasing and the construction of all that, might be more than somebody should take on when they're just getting started. So start with a minimum viable project. Be willing to share and be honest when you need help. Having that open dialogue with folks, you can learn from them, and they can learn from you, and you can start to build a network that way and share resources. And give your community what it needs. Don't build something just because it's your preference. In this talk, in this presentation right now, we're introducing all sorts of different unit types. And these different unit types respond to unmet needs when the industry, the real estate industry right now primarily delivers single family houses in large apartment complexes. But as Elizabeth mentioned, there's a whole range of stuff between that, that can respond to different income levels, different family arrangements. So research that and understand, and give your community what it needs, and find your niche. And once again, insist that revenues match cost, right? Complexity will add cost to your project, and then that cost demands higher rents. And so we'll repeat this often. You'll hear me say this a bunch. But what we say is, if you can't get the rents, don't do the building. And so the market that a small developer is working in will often dictate the level of amenity and/or the complexity of a building in order to be able to meet the market for their achievable rents. My ADU, I was quoted $390,000 to build my ADU. This means, just a quick 1% rule of thumb, means that I would need $4,000 rents. And that is not achievable in my backyard. So remember, if you can't get the rent, don't build the building. Right, so when we talk about different building types and adding complexity, bigger buildings are more expensive to build. But oftentimes, when you have more units, you can absorb that cost. So if you've got a really large mixed-use building, you can absorb some of that cost and some of that additional construction technology. But in the reverse, just because small buildings are less expensive, that does not mean they're automatically affordable. Oftentimes, local zoning and processes, these things will add additional costs that are hard for just a few units to absorb. I'm thinking of things like the lot area per unit requirements that are common in zoning codes. Sometimes these will require the purchase of an additional lot, so that'll be doubling the land acquisition cost, for a 2 to 4 unit building. And then also thinking of excessive parking requirements that take up a lot of space and may also increase those land costs. So complexity corresponds to code thresholds. There are thresholds in building codes. There are thresholds in finance, accessibility, and the Fair Housing Act. So let's go over some of the main ones. Right? So take advantage of these code thresholds, especially in that 2 to 4 unit range of that middle housing diagram that Elizabeth showed. There is a lot that happens just at that low end. Once you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, there's so much that happens with building code, sprinklers, and even finance in that 2 to 4 unit range. And so here are some rules of thumb to keep in mind, particularly around elevators and sprinklers. Right. So once you get to, we say 0 to 3 stories, And the reason for that is because at 4 stories, the building code requires you to have a second stairwell. Well, that stairwell costs more money and it takes up more space to build. If you put any of your commercial uses upstairs, those commercial uses need to be accessible. So if you have a second story commercial space, now you need an elevator because it needs to be ADA. And that not the accessible unit downstairs, that has to do with the Fair Housing Act. And you can simply avoid that. If you put all 4 units up on a second story or third story, you'll have to add an elevator. But if you just take one of those units, keep it on the ground floor, keep it accessible, you can bypass that requirement. And then the same going for sprinklers. You know, if you start to mix uses, you're going to get into sprinkler territory. That'll add additional costs. Buildings with 3 or more units, so that's kind of that 2 to 4 unit threshold. There's a threshold for sprinklers in there. When you go from 2 to 3, you're going to be required to do sprinkler system. Or if you're just in a more restrictive state like California. Right, and this is why we suggest working with existing buildings, because oftentimes they will be grandfathered in as long as you don't do too many major updates or renovations. But here are some examples of existing buildings that can be purchased owner occupied. And so let me just pause right here and ask if anybody, did you know that 1 to 4 units is considered a house by the Fed? So like the Federal Housing Administration will underwrite a 30-year mortgage for 2 to 4 units, the same they will for a standard single-family house. The federal underwriting system does not see any difference between those. And in fact, it allows 4 units with a small amount of commercial space, which is what we saw the project that Kerry did in Bothell. So he's got a 4-plex, and down in the corner, he's got a barber shop. And that is all under, like you just go and, you know, you have to apply for that. It's based on your credit worthiness and income and things like that. And, you know, subject to appraisal based on comps, just like a house or a duplex would be. But it's actually our local zoning that treats these 2 to 4 units differently and ends up being more restrictive by excluding them. But these don't all have to be under one roof, right? So we're talking about 2, 3, 4 units. We can look at, you know, some of these combinations of things. So if we think about what these unit types bring to a neighborhood, all of these achieve a lot of the same, or a lot of the aims that we have for improving our neighborhoods. So like a pop-up market or a food cart pod is a great way to bring more restaurants to a neighborhood without even triggering any permanent construction. You know, you set up some poles, set up some temporary electricity, and bring folks in and park them on an underused parking lot. The one in the middle here is Bootleg Shop House. This is an interesting way to add a little bit of workspace, you know, without being mixed use. So maybe, you know, what we're showing here is a duplex with a little bit of workspace in the back. Maybe one of the duplex tenants uses that as an office space, in theory. And then on the right here, the duplex court, that is what you're seeing is 3 duplexes arranged around a common green. And so what that does is that adds 6 units to a parcel, but remains below that sprinkler threshold by separating the buildings, right? So remember I said that 3 units, you get into sprinkler zone. Well, what if you don't go to 3, but you keep them at 2? So you can get to 6 units without going over that sprinkler threshold. Also, you know, 3 duplexes around a common green are less imposing than 6 units under one roof. So let's talk about building codes. There is the IRC, and that stands for International Residential Code. So most of the 0 to 3 story buildings are going to fall under this designation. At the 4th story, I mentioned, is where the building code requires a second stairwell. Also, don't stack uses. Instead, if you have a different use, maybe put them horizontal to keep it less intense, or better yet, detach to stay out of the International Building Code. And then with IBC, stands for International Building Code, and this is a really important threshold to consider in doing a small project, because when you get into IBC territory, costs go up considerably, because now you'll be drawing from a smaller, more specialized group of contractors. When you're doing international residential codes kind of stuff, most contractors can work under that. IBC, they get a little more specialized. And oftentimes these contractors are likely doing larger projects, and they may not be interested in your small project. And so you might want to keep it below that threshold. Additionally, you get into fire suppression technology. This adds costs. If you've ever been in a parking garage, you'll see that the stuff that was sprayed on the steel beams, that's a very high level of fire suppression. And also, depending on the building type, your construction methods will jump in cost. And so if you start to get too big or too tall, you might need to start adding concrete on the bottom floor or steel. So you want to keep things small, and usually 1 to 3 stories is perfect for just a wood frame walk-up. So most jurisdictions in the United States exempt IRC buildings from the sprinkler requirements suggested in the latest code. But as a reminder, right, we're talking about generalizations. And so, in Virginia, in your local community, you want to check with your local building department. But why does this matter to us? Why do we care about all these things? I mean, we want safe and compliant buildings. But what we learn is that life safety requirements are not always applied in a proportionable or reasonable way. And so we just need to be aware of these thresholds so that we can operate within them and still achieve our goals, right? Because we don't want to move over a threshold and end up being required an elevator, because an elevator is just too expensive. And you have the ongoing maintenance and checkup for that. And that might just be too expensive for a small scale project. And sprinklers, if you cross that threshold, that's a massive expense to account for. And our building design has to either avoid or pay for these costs, right? So if we have to add an elevator and now we've got to add a sprinkler, but we don't have a lot of use to amortize that cost, we get into an expensive build, and then we get into required expensive rents. So these are some IRC ideas, right? So we're staying in the International Residential Code territory. So we have a lot of options in this. I'm not going to go into a bunch of details on any of these, but the key here is just to communicate. You can still do multi-unit infill within the idea of a 1 or 2 dwelling building, right? So most of these are probably doable under single dwelling zoning, provided your community allows ADUs. And then that guest suite is based on the definition of a unit, which what we find to be the most common is just that inclusion of the stove. And then a home business, most folks allow that. So here's some more options still. We're staying within that IRC territory. We've got a 5 to 9 unit cottage court. That's quite a few units. And then we've got the semi-detached and the row house, which are similar but slightly different. On the semi-detached, these are kind of more like townhomes. There might be that demising wall between the two. There might be a little bit of fire protection. Maybe it's thicker wallboard or maybe doubled up. So a little bit of different construction technology in those walls. It's called a fire rated wall. But no elevators, no sprinklers, anything like that. And then these here are pushing the International Residential Code to the max, right? And the purpose of this category is just to keep construction costs low, so we don't move into a different threshold, but we're still able to make the project pencil with additional units if necessary. But note that this does not solve the zoning issue. You still need to be allowed to build ADUs. You still need to be allowed to build duplex courts or accessory commercial units, which is like that. One of those original images that Mike was doing has a little shop front on the front of the residential building. So let's get into IGC territory. Basically, keep it small. Don't mix uses. And then how you mix uses has a bearing on that if you do mix uses. And also, if you buy an older building and you're renovating it, don't, understand those thresholds and don't rock the boat. And if you don't change the occupancy of a building type, right, you can oftentimes, it'll be grandfathered in and you can keep it the way it is without having to update it to current contemporary codes. And just, obviously don't make a building more hazardous. Moving along, these are buildings that have less expensive sprinkler systems called NFPA 13R. So these are plastic pipes. And NFPA stands for National Fire Protection Association. So, if you've got an old house and you carve it up into multiple units, you might probably be required to do residential sprinklers, maybe a fourplex, because you're over that 3-unit mark, a triplex or fourplex, an apartment building. But these aren't going to be, there are 2 levels of sprinklers. And so we can get into that and take a look at these. These are also residential sprinklers, but this is with a caveat. At this level, I would recommend checking with your local code. It's starting to get, pretty serious. When you're looking at a courtyard apartment, local code very often might require some kind of sprinkle system, right? And then in this is where we get into the no-joke sprinklers. These are the NFPA 13. These are going to be your metal pipes. You're probably have to get a riser room, maybe, which is a pretty big ordeal from what I understand, and super expensive. And then also, so consider ADA thresholds. So, not that we shouldn't accommodate those with disabilities, just there are ways to do it without making your building more expensive. Right. So if you've got that form follows finance, Main Street Light on the left, that's the one carried in Bothell. So he wasn't required to do, was he? No, he wasn't required to do any ADA accessibility, but obviously his commercial space on the bottom did need to be, right? So understand these ADA thresholds and when that kicks in. And then let's also talk about some of the financing thresholds, because financing has a threshold to be aware of, and that is when you get to 5 or more units, right? So at that 5-unit mark, so once you get to 4, and then you go to 5 units, now it's going to be required to have commercial financing, and you won't be able to do an owner-occupied 5+ unit project. And so if your strategy is to do a commercial owner-occupied project, you want to be cognizant of that. But to make it even more clear, I'm just kidding, as thick as mud, you can also buy a 1 to 4 unit building with a commercial loan, but you can also buy 1 to 4 units as an owner-occupied mortgage. So depending on your strategy on how you want to go about financing your projects, keep that in mind. But use the most simple financing that works for your situation. And this graphic goes into the increasing complexity of finance associated with different building types. So, there are some projects that you might just do with cash, personal debt. Maybe you take out a line of credit because you've got some equity in your home. And then when you get into a residential mortgage, you've got some qualifications, some credit issues, and then some terms there. And then you're starting to get into the deep end when you get into commercial mortgages and how those are structured and the terms there. And if you really want to get complicated, you can get into tax credits, public-private partnerships, government grants. There's like historic tax credits. And many of you that work in government are probably working with some of these and working with developers, sophisticated developers that do these kinds of projects. But for a beginner developer, that would be super complex. So let's move along here. Cash and personal debt, probably going to use these for like fix and flips on a house, maybe build an accessory dwelling unit, taking out a home equity line of credit, or even just tapping friends and family. And here's some examples, right? So if you're just going to renovate a triplex or a fourplex, right? That could be an option. Now, if you get into a residential mortgage, you'd probably be looking at, like I said, 1 to 4 units, maybe a Main Street rehab, maybe a live work unit. And then the kind of loan that you'd be looking at there, you could do, a construction loan that goes over to permanent, built, or financed owner occupied. And then there are some different home style renovation and FHA 203K. These are loans that will give you money for construction as an owner occupied investor. And here's some of the examples, right? So buying 2 to 4 units or a double duplex, right? So maybe you bought a duplex and then you added a duplex in the backyard, provided your zoning allows that. And that could be done with your typical conventional 30-year mortgage. But once you get over 5 and you start including non-residential space, you get into commercial mortgage territory. And this is, anything in an LLC. So an LLC can buy 1, 2, 3, or 4 units. But if you're going to do anything 5+, it'll be required to have a commercial mortgage. And then any kind of multi-tenant commercial or larger land development, you can do that in a commercial mortgage. And so looking at some examples here, an apartment building, 3-story walk-up building, anywhere from 5 to 20 units. It's going to take a commercial loan. And then a multi-tenant commercial, like you see in your typical Main Street scenario. So I've got some takeaways for you that can help get you started. Things to keep in mind: keep it 1 to 3 stories. Avoid that second stairwell. There's this power of 4, right? Don't go to 4 stories. Max 4 units per stair per floor on a walk-up. And then consider multiple small buildings to separate occupancies and stay in the IRC zone. So if you want to have some kind of non-residential space, maybe break that off and set that aside so it's not connected. And then there won't be the concern about fire transfer. And then keep your commercial space under that threshold for sprinklers, which your local code will define. And keep your accessible units on the ground floor so you don't have to provide an elevator for all of your residents. Also, keep your amenities on the ground floor. If you go and put a roof deck on your on your building, now that needs to be accessible, and every route to get there needs to be accessible. And so maybe rather than a roof deck, as fun as those are, keep it in the backyard, maybe make a beautiful ground-oriented courtyard. So this is what we covered today in right-sizing your project. Do something legal, also known as by right. Keep it simple. Give your community what it needs. There's actually lots of options outside of the standard real estate industry that might be interesting to explore and provide, and that will kind of define your niche. And then always insist that revenues match costs. So, and if you write this one down, if you can't get the rents, don't build the building, right? And so don't make your building so expensive that it becomes too expensive for the market to afford. And then understand and take advantage of these different code thresholds and use the most simple financing that works. So I'm happy to get over and talk with you all in some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil and Elizabeth. We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Neil, we are still seeing your screen, just FYI.
Oh, thank you.
So the first question that we had is, do the growth management acts of either Washington State or Oregon shape an environment for incremental development in a way that is different from other states? So kicking it right off with a good in-depth question from Mark McCaskill down in Martinsville.
Yeah, and full disclosure, this is more of a personal curiosity question because from 2016 to 2019, I was the managing director for growth management services at the Washington State Department of Commerce. And so I heard Elizabeth say something about being appointed at UW. And then, of course, Neil was using Oregon examples.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that it shapes the environment in a different way just by nature of not allowing as much sprawling low density development. But I'm going to let Neil answer that in more depth because he happens to live in a growth management state.
Right. And for those that aren't aware, here in the state of Oregon, every city is required to have an urban growth boundary. And that is supposed to be required to be able to absorb 20 years worth of all types of development, housing, industrial, everything. So what that does is it puts a little bit of constraint on growth. And then to your question, Mark, I think what that does is I think it makes housing issues in particular more acute. And then it puts the pressure on zoning. So rather than, and I like to compare to Houston, right? A very different approach. And so, and they both have pros and cons. And so while we constrain our growth in Washington and Oregon for the purposes of environmental preservation, but also agricultural preservation, right? It puts more pressure. Interestingly enough, I'll just talk about Portland. We had a down zone in 1959, and now 85% of the city of Portland was single family only for like 50 years. That urban growth boundary was not allowed to grow out per se. The idea is that we would grow up, but we were so constrained in our zoning that it just made the housing issues much more acute, and it put pressure on updating the local zoning. And then obviously that has happened elsewhere, and the state had stepped in, and then House Bill 2001. And for those that don't know, that's a statewide bill that allows duplexes and fourplexes everywhere in single dwelling zones. Does that help, Mark? But what I was going to say about Houston.
It does, and I don't mean to take up everybody's time with all this. I was just curious based on my previous experience because by 2019, a lot of this stuff had already started to happen in the Pacific Northwest. Olympia was facing its missing middle zoning battle that I think has been ongoing and all that stuff. And all these things have really come to the fore, especially missing middle.
Yes, very much so.
And to that end, talking about housing types, our next question is from Jenny, and she wants to know, how is a podium building different from a second story building?
Elizabeth, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by a second story building, but a podium building is a building type that has the ground floor is a different construction type than the upper floors. And there are specific code thresholds associated with that. So typically the ground floor would be a concrete and steel base, typically used for commercial or more kind of live work type uses. The upper floors are a wood construction, and you can go to a maximum of 5 stories in that construction type. And so not sure exactly what's meant by a second story building, but that's a podium building.
And Jenny, if you're still with us, she says thank you. So I think that must have helped with the question. So I have a question myself. For a locality that wants to see this kind of development happen, that they are facing housing pressures, they have affordability issues, they have more people moving in, not enough inventory. What should they be considering in their zoning to make sure that they are allowing for these kinds of creative missing middle housing units?
Neil, you want to take a first pass?
Yeah, you bet. Well, you could start at the use table, right? And then we allow them. Now, what I've noticed though, in some places that I've worked, is the use table does allow 2, 3, or 4 units in a low density zone, but then there's like a fine print that comes along with that. And I mentioned that lot area per unit requirement. And then you realize real quickly that, oh, the lots in the community come in set sizes. They're typically a certain size. And then when you do this lot area per unit, the lot area per unit ends up working out such that you need an additional lot, or you need more square footage than your typical lot size, right? So then that requires you to purchase a second lot, because they come in increments of lot sizes, not just, you don't go shave off 500 square feet for your needs. And then you're hoping that, oh, well, I hope that not lot next door is for sale. And then sometimes when you've got to then park that on top of that, it gets ever increasingly larger and larger. And then, so that's some of the fine print, I think, in the zoning to look at, is that lot area per unit requirement, and understanding that many of these buildings aren't that much larger than a single family house, than a large single family house. And so if a large single family house can fit on a lot, so can a threeplex or a fourplex.
Yeah, and I'll add on, it's a tough question to answer succinctly because there's so many different things that need to be fixed in zoning ordinances, but not just zoning ordinances, in all of the overlapping regulations. But specifically to what Neil was saying, the first step is allowing the use, or allowing the building type. And that's something we've been pushing for years. Well, if you want more accessory dwelling units, you have to allow them. And then places go and they allow them, or they allow a quadplex to be built in a single family zone, like Neil's saying in Portland. So in Atlanta, we've allowed accessory dwelling units. Not that many have actually been built. So we've allowed them, we've changed the zoning, what gives? Well, there's other things besides use in the zoning that you have to be aware of, like minimum parking requirements, or like Neil's saying, minimum lot sizes or minimum home sizes, that then make providing that use physically impossible or financially impossible. And then the other regulations that play into it, things like your land use. Say you allow the building type in your zoning, but your underlying land use doesn't match. You have to change your land use, which is a whole nother process. So all of these things are overlapping and conflicting with each other. So it's, I think, understanding that it's more than just the zoning, and it's more than just allowing the uses. So not the best answer, but it's complicated.
It is complicated, and it looks like Chris McNamara with Virginia Housing, who had been on the meeting earlier, has had to jump off. But Virginia Housing does have some grants available for localities to take a look at their zoning and really identify what those barriers are to creating this kind of housing. So I'm going to throw Virginia Housing under the bus and encourage people to get a hold of them. Mark McCaskill has another question, and Mark, you were reading my mind. I was going to ask, what is the role of lenders in this? But Mark is going to get more specific. Does the presence of a CDFI help with some of the financing barriers? So lenders and CDFIs and how they can help in this arena.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I'm working in a community right now that wants to introduce ADUs. ADUs are super hard to finance right now. Appraisers don't know how to work with them, and so then the bank needs the appraiser to understand how to underwrite it. And it can become real difficult real quick. And even the project that I mentioned that Carrie did, technically the feds underwrite that loan, and he was able to get the construction loan to build that fourplex with a little bit of non-residential space. They allow up to 25% of non-residential space. So while the technical standards from the feds will underwrite that, he had trouble getting it refinanced. Local banks were like, what is this? It's mixed use. And he said, no, it's not mixed use. That's non-residential space. That's only a fourplex. It got really confusing really quick. And so that is key in a lot of these places. So while we're talking about national, prototypes in general, building types in general, when it comes down to the lenders, you need a lender willing to lend on these and understand the underwriting and understand, and then having the systems in place that they have the appraisers and stuff that they can work with to service these loans. And that can be a huge challenge.
So not just lenders, but the appraisers as well is a key piece there.
Yeah,
Elizabeth,
100%.
anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'll just say on that, yes, it's the whole package. So it's the lenders, it's the appraisers, and it's increasing access to capital for folks that might not have a big track record. So CDFIs can help in that space.
And that is going to lead into the rest of my day. So that's great information to have. Courtney Maley is asking, how do I find tenants for my commercial space? Courtney, I will just mention that some of our webinars coming up later in this series next week, we'll be talking about finding developers to create the housing in your community. And the following week, we'll be talking to VCC about how we then find tenants for these commercial spaces when we're doing mixed use downtown. So hold up, you will get answers to those questions in future sessions. I am going to jump to Jenny's question. What are your thoughts about second-story mixed-use buildings requiring a certain amount of parking spaces for the second-story dwelling units in a small downtown with under 2,000 residents? So she's getting very specific here.
I can take a first pass. I mean, I'm very pro not requiring parking, just generally in zoning codes, and I know that's a big lift for a lot of places. But it's not to say that I don't think parking should exist. It's that I don't think we should legally require it. So definitely for a second story mixed use dwelling unit on top of a commercial space in downtown with less than 2,000 residents. So the more parking you're requiring to be on site in your downtown, the less space you have to infill development. So the less infill development you have, the less people can walk to your downtown and use those spaces. So the more people need to drive. So it like creates this kind of feedback cycle of needing more and more parking and getting less and less of the development types that you actually need. So I would say looking at alternate compliance paths for providing parking could be a good solution. Like, does your place allow you to count on-street parking towards meeting those parking minimums? Can you use shared parking? So the commercial space uses it in the daytime and the residential unit uses it at nighttime. So you're not creating 4 spaces, you're just using 2 spaces and you're sharing them. So things like that to try and not create more parking than you need to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The requiring word right there is the tough one for I think both of us. Not that developers won't build parking, they will, but requiring them takes their option away from them, and puts it in the hands of the governing body to tell them exactly how much they need. And really, depending on the market that the developer is building for, the developer may be building specifically for a car-free lifestyle tenant, and so for the government to require parking in that scenario, although uncommon, right? But you understand, you get my thought process here. But if you were to build the parking, if you chose to build the parking as a developer, I would consider how you went about doing that, right? So is it a surface space? Are you trying to go underground with it? Or are you doing tuck under and having some of the residential units over it? All of those are going to have major cost implications. And so that's why the requiring is so important in allowing the flexibility for a developer to choose how they go about parking, making their project more feasible.
Also great information. So Jenny, to follow up on what Elizabeth was saying too, in terms of the underutilized parking spaces that may exist or the varying times, I understand you're talking about a community with 2,000 residents. There's probably not public transportation, but there may be churches downtown, and they also tend to have parking spaces that are underutilized and may be willing to share. So I'm going to share my screen again. And since we do have Courtney's question on commercial tenants still there, Neil and Elizabeth, any ideas for Courtney on finding tenants for her commercial space?
I do. if you have an existing, I'm not sure if you have an existing commercial space, but one thing that I've seen here locally and I suggest is if you're, purchase an underutilized parking lot and you're one way to activate that space before you build anything is to bring in some mobile vendors. And then what you're doing is you're generating relationships with those folks for future development. And then you can get them when they're ready to go brick and mortar, you can then move them into your brick and mortar commercial spaces.
Great, thank you for that. And I will note we are at 1:29 according to my technology, Eastern Time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Liliana, we can stop the recording whenever you're ready. We will be posting this session on the DHCD YouTube page and